It was a stormy night in the rural town of Edenville, North Carolina, when Emily started her shift at the old St. James Hospital. The facility had been around for over a century, and while it had been renovated, there were parts of it that still carried the weight of its age. Most of the newer staff didn't venture into the old wings after dark, and Emily had heard more than a few rumors about things that had happened in the hospital's past. But she always chalked it up to superstition. That was until she encountered room 18. Emily's first task that evening was to check on a new patient, a man named Charles Dempsey, admitted with a serious infection. He had been placed in room 18, an isolated room at the end of a narrow hallway in the oldest wing of the hospital. When Emily arrived, she felt an odd chill as she walked past the other rooms. The corridor was empty, its walls lined with faded, peeling paint. As she approached room 18, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, and the dim light inside flickered intermittently. She pushed the door open. Inside, Charles lay in the bed, his body covered in a thin white sheet. He appeared to be in deep sleep, his face pale, his chest rising and falling in a shallow rhythm. What caught Emily's attention was the strange, almost unnatural stillness of the room. It was as if the very air had become thick and oppressive. "Mr. Dempsey?" she called softly, but he didn't stir. She stepped closer to check his vitals, but as her hand hovered over the monitor, she felt a sharp coldness wash over her. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly, she could see her breath misting in the air. Her skin prickled with unease. "Hello? Are you awake?" she asked again. There was no response, but Emily swore she could hear faint murmurs, like a whispering voice just out of reach. She turned quickly, looking around the dim room, but all she saw was the shadowy outline of the window. Suddenly, Charles's hand twitched, and he let out a low, guttural sound. Emily leaned closer, her pulse quickening. His eyes shot open, wide and unblinking, the whites of his eyes glowing eerily in the dim light. "Get out of this room," he rasped, his voice dry and hoarse. "You shouldn't be here." Emily stumbled back, her heart racing. She reached for the call button, but as her finger touched it, the lights above her flickered and went out. The room was plunged into total darkness. Panic surged in her chest. Then she heard it, the sound of something dragging across the floor. She froze, trying to listen closely. The dragging noise grew louder, closer. Slowly, she turned, her eyes straining to adjust to the darkness. In the corner of the room, she saw something moving, slowly, crawling toward her. It wasn't Charles. The figure was hunched, with long, bony limbs, and a pale, skeletal face that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Its eyes were wide, empty voids, nothing but black pits. "Leave!" the thing whispered, its voice a hollow, rasping echo. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She backed away, her body trembling with fear, but the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. The figure moved closer, its limbs dragging along the floor, leaving behind a trail of wet, sticky marks. "Get out!" she screamed, pounding on the door with both hands. Her heart was pounding so loud she could barely hear anything else. Finally, with a sickening creak, the door swung open. Emily didn't hesitate. She bolted from the room, running down the dark hallway, not daring to look back. She rushed to the nurse's station, gasping for breath. The head nurse, a calm, elderly woman named Nurse Whitaker, looked up from her desk. "Is everything okay, Emily?" Nurse Whitaker asked, her voice soothing but somehow detached. Emily was shaking, her voice barely a whisper. "There's something in room 18. It's not Mr. Dempsey, there's something else. Something wrong." Nurse Whitaker's expression shifted, and for the first time, Emily saw a flicker of something unsettling in her eyes. "You saw it, didn't you? The thing in the room?" Emily nodded, too terrified to speak. "Room 18, Nurse Whitaker said softly, her voice taking on a mournful tone, "has always been a problem. The hospital was built over an old asylum, you see. Many of the patients from those days were not well. Some were not even human anymore. They left their marks on this place. And sometimes they still linger." Emily's heart sank as she listened. "Mr. Dempsey," Nurse Whitaker continued, "wasn't just suffering from an infection. He was being haunted by something that's been in that room for decades. Emily turned to look toward the hallway, where the lights flickered again. I'm not going back there, she said firmly. I can't. Nurse Whitaker nodded slowly. You don't have to. Just don't let anyone else go in there tonight. Room 18 never lets go of its visitors. And if you're not careful. She paused and gave Emily a sympathetic look. You might become one of its permanent residents. The next morning, when Emily checked the records, she found that Charles Dempsey had mysteriously disappeared overnight. There was no record of him leaving. And when the room was checked, it was completely empty. But in the corner of the room, there were fresh, dragging marks across the floor. And on the bed, there was an old, yellowed sheet, still soaked with the faintest trace of blood. After that night, Emily never returned to St. James Hospital. And room 18, it seemed, was still waiting for its next visitor.